Good evening and welcome to tonight's Critical Conversations. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome you here. My name's Rehema White. I'm going to chair the conversation tonight. I'm an academic in sustainable development at the University of St Andrews, and I've got a particular interest in nature conservation and nature restoration. And I've been appreciating the autumn russet tones we've been having today. So I'm going to just first tell you a little bit about Critical Conversations and how we want to run this, and then we're going to introduce today's excellent panelists. Critical Conversations brings together voices from a variety of different perspectives to consider some of the really big issues of our time. And this one has been run from museums, and I think that makes it really interesting. So how can we learn from the past? How can we provoke people in different ways to think about and act on some of these issues? We're live today. We're going to be recorded and available later on YouTube as well. For those of you who are watching live, you can submit a question via the Q&A function, and we have Sarah in the background who's going to be watching and passing on questions later in the sessions. As we're going to be talking today a little bit about the Return to Mingulay exhibition, so a little bit more about that just now. But first of all, I'd like our panel to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Matthew. If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm Matthew Hawkins. I'm the Conservation Manager for the Cairngorms National Park Authority. Part of my role is about the delivery of the Cairngorms Nature Action Plan, which is a strategic conservation document that allows us to manage and join in partnership with others on the delivery of conservation across the park. I also manage a programme of works that is delivered directly from the Park Authority as well, and I manage the team.
Hi, I'm Alistair Macleod. I work for Transition University of St Andrews, based within the Estates Department at the university. And part of my role is to support biodiversity work within the university and further afield. So really looking at how we can change our management practice here, but also get young people, local residents, staff involved in supporting biodiversity projects.
Hi, yeah, and I'm Eva. I'm a fourth year biology and geography student here at St Andrews. I'm also the environment officer for the Students' Association, so I'm sort of in charge of representing students' voices and student advocacy for issues of environmentalism, biodiversity and sustainability, and I'm also a member of the Biodiversity Literacy VIP here, which links in with the topic of our conversation this evening.
So today's conversation is really prompted by an exhibition at the Wardlaw Museum in the University of St Andrews, which is on the scores that we all know and love here in St Andrews. This exhibition, I really hope you will go and see it before it finishes in January, is made of a set of photographs from 3 different photographers who went to the island and took series of photographs. Now, the island was inhabited, but it was abandoned in 1912 for complex reasons. And so we have photographs since 1912, 100 years later, taken in 2021, showing how the island has changed. And that leads us to think today a little bit about the absence or the presence of humans in nature. Is it a good thing when we become absent? Can nature recover itself better without us? Or does our presence have some kind of impact? So those are the questions we're going to be talking about today. How can we be present if we are in a better way? I'm going to start off with Matthew and ask Matthew, what does this mean to you? How do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Rehema. There's a couple of points here. Firstly, I would like to emphasize that presence of absence of people to some extent is not quite correct when you think that people are also part of nature. And I think it's very important in conservation not to divorce ourselves from nature as a whole, because it then sets us apart, which is never a good thing, and it can affect the way that people regard the natural environment if they think that's not for us. Also, the Mingulay example is a really interesting one because having removed a community, a population from the area, it hasn't exactly gone back to where it would have been before. So the expression rewilding is often used nowadays, which I don't particularly like because we can never really go back to a kind of imagined pristine condition because there is the residue of human impact on that site. We know that grazing was occupied on Mingulay up until the 1950s, that rabbits were introduced, presumably as a food source or come across, I don't know about the rats, but often these herbivores come in as part of that process. And so the environment on Mingulay is never going to be pristine because it has these residues of human activity. What we can do is restore ecological processes. And I think that's a much more positive way of looking at things, because what we're looking to do is get the processes working well in conservation and then hopefully move forward to a new condition.
I think that's really interesting. So what you're basically saying, Matthew, is that we can't ever be fully absent, and being absent won't necessarily take us back to a good place. It's interesting because this is something we discuss with our students, and we talk a little bit about land sharing and land sparing. What's the best way to keep nature? Is it best to actually shut off areas and have national parks or islands without anybody on them, or should we actually think about how we share land? But then what does that mean for some of these areas that we talk about that are great wilderness areas? And I don't think there's necessarily a perfect answer to that in any kind of way. One of the concerns we have about land sparing as well is that in many places we've seen Indigenous peoples who've been removed from different areas. So there's it's very difficult to be able to justify that. And we're now looking at post-colonial forms of conservation and trying to adjust some of the wrongs that we have done in the past by including people in that context. But there's so much theory we can talk about. I wonder if we can think about it in a very practical way as well. So I wonder if we can pop over to you, Ali.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And when we're thinking of St Andrews and other urban areas or semi-urban areas, we're not going to remove people. We have to make sure that that their role here is going to be supportive of biodiversity because they're integrated into it. And I guess when we're thinking of how we change our land management practices to support biodiversity, we're really about bringing people along that journey. Young people, old people, it doesn't matter. We need to give them, that sense of wonder, that agency, that they're able to take part in this process as well, in changing their gardens and the landscapes that they have control over, or whether they're just taking part in practical activities, which might be put on by environmental organisations like the one Matt works for, but also Transition here in St Andrews. We're trying to change land management practices on a big scale, not as big as Matthew's at the Cairngorms Park, but on a scale when we're talking about the local parks that we have, the coastal walk, changing these the land management practice so that we're able to support biodiversity across those areas. But people are very much part of that, and I think it doesn't matter whether they're planting a tree or they're just looking at a woodlouse going about its business. It's that link to nature that is going to be so important for them to value it and therefore take action. And you know, we're about providing that experience as well as changing, I guess, the landscape around us. And as a university, recognizing that we're not a massive, we don't own huge amounts of land, but we are part of a network of green spaces and spaces that can be of value for biodiversity. But they're also the places where people are, and whether they're students and researchers, they have the opportunity to go out there into that landscape and explore it and undertake research and sort of test out their theories. But that sort of linkage with people and land, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, I think as well, talking from the St Andrews specific perspective as well, I think a lot of the work that's done with the biodiversity vertically integrated project that I'm a part of here and that any student can apply to do is really important in terms of the sort of student specific engagement and really looking at how young people, taking myself as a 21-year-old as young, but I think it's really important to try and link people with biodiversity and with the nature that's on their doorstep. I think, for example, what goes on in the Cairngorms National Park, I would go on holiday there when I was younger. I think it's really great for having those sort of high value, seeing nature in its sort of truest form. There's not really the same presence of humans there as, for example, I'm from just outside Glasgow, so it's hard to have the same replication of an urban wild space. But I think then coming to St Andrews, where there's just so much biodiversity on your doorstep, there's so much life by the sea, there's delayed braes, you can kind of go and see some farmland sort of birds, there's Tentsmuir. We're in a really special place here that I think, obviously, as Ali said, we're never going to remove humans from St Andrews, we're never going to remove humans from the environment, but I think learning how to live with it and trying to build connections where people don't feel like it's us and nature, we are part of nature. I think in terms of the conversation of this, the topic of this conversation, reframing what presence of humans is, like we are a part of nature and part of the environment. So I think from the student specific perspective, trying to engage students with identifying the birds around them, trying to identify them with that we live with this, we are not separate and trying to compromise, we need to try and facilitate a better environment is really important. And I think all of the work that's done on the large scale, but also specifically here in St Andrews, is really important for fostering that.
It's great to hear you talk about that, Eva, and I absolutely appreciate all those places as well, that even though we live in a town, we can access nature. You can see some of the West Sands there behind Ali today, and we're really lucky in St Andrews to actually have so much nature. It's really interesting, some of the literature around nature connectedness, because there's much more awareness now about how we are connected to nature and how nature can actually support well-being. One thing we saw during COVID, for example, was when people were allowed out for their hourly walk each day, there was a huge well-being benefit that actually came from people being out in nature. And there's an extensive literature now looking at how that works in different kinds of ways. And a part of it seems to be that we keep that appreciation, that sense of awe. So when we see a really big landscape, we have a sense of perspective about who we are as humans and how we fit into that landscape. And that's supposed to be very good psychologically. There are also ways in which we can appreciate that awe, which is supported by looking at something very small and very beautiful or very particular in some kind of way. So looking in detail at the structure a flower, for example. And people are looking at the well-being effects. You know, did you know you get more well-being effects if you exercise outside in a wilder form of nature than you do inside? So I think these are all ways of understanding our relationships with nature, and linking back to this notion of biophilia, that we as humans are innately better off if we can engage with nature in some kinds of ways. I want to talk a little bit later about the education aspect of this and come back to learning and what we can do to support people in that. But I think there's something here about how much we deal with nature that's sealed away in protected areas, or how we manage protected areas with people. And I wonder, Matthew, do you think you could come back in on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that a lot of our protected areas for nature were designated in the 80s and the 90s, including some of the international ones. And to some extent, they were absolutely of their time. And they have historically provided some really valuable sort of areas where nature can be safeguarded, which during that period was actually really, really important. It could be said that in an ideal world, we should move away from protected areas. And if we are looking, sort of looking to see how we develop this idea, we should, again, one of the issues around some protected areas is that they were designated at a time when the habitat was at a certain point, and they're kind of quite fixed. And this concept of natural processes can sometimes be hindered by designations. So we need to look bigger. We need to look beyond natural areas. We need to look at nature networks and how we can link all these natural areas and protected areas together so that we have a network. So species can move across landscapes and they can adapt by their own means to whatever climate change brings to them. It's really important that we start moving away from just thinking about protected areas, whether that is a small local nature area or it is a national park indeed. But one of the important points about these, especially local areas, is they are often very highly valued by residents. And just to reiterate, in a way, the point that you were making earlier, we should never underestimate how important it is to have wild animals in our urban spaces. And although I speak from a Cairngorms National Park sort of perspective, I'm very aware of the value. We have, for example, in Glasgow, a population of water voles, which is extraordinary. We spent a lot of time and money trying to protect them here in the Cairngorms, and there's a population thriving in Glasgow. Otters are well known for living in these areas. On the continent, we've seen lynx come into urban areas. Nature can find a home amongst us, and we can see real wild animals and plants wherever we look. Context is important here.
Yeah, we're seeing that as well, Matthew, how we can change large-scale areas like parks, but also valuing all those verges and small panels of grassland that those landscape architects and local authorities like to slip in, and they like to mow them so that to within an inch of their lives, so stripping out all the biodiversity, putting in lots of nutrients, and sort of just going down to a few grass species that has very little value. But switching the management regime for those places can not only reduce carbon emissions, it's cutting them less, or putting a sort of more of a meadow management technique on, and reducing the nutrients within the soil by cutting and collecting the grass arisings. That then leads to higher biodiversity and less growth for the grass. So we're seeing that. We've been running a program here for the last couple of years, Meadows in the Making, where we're practicing that on a large scale. We're trying to encourage other partners and Fife Council as well are looking at it to adopt too, and really supporting that nature across all these spaces, as well as encouraging local residents to take up these practices within their gardens. I want to come back. We are seeing that within the university's grounds too. We have red squirrels, badgers coming in, deer. It's really great to see those, as well as insect diversity being shown to go up when we're changing our management of these spaces. And Eva was talking about a program that she's been working on where they've been measuring that biodiversity. So maybe you can come in with that as well, Eva.
Yeah, no, so for those of you who are here and obviously don't really know about the Biodiversity Literacy VIP, it's essentially a group of students across all disciplines of the university, not just biology or geography, and it essentially has the goal of going out and monitoring and mapping what biodiversity we have on university managed land. So basically for credits, I get to go out with my binoculars and my hiking boots and my raincoat and survey and look for birds, and then it all ends up contributing to the university's biodiversity action plan. It contributes to the conservation efforts such as Meadows in the Making that we work with Transition to fulfil and to make our campus more biodiversity positive. And I think within that, something that I've really been able to gain is sort of natural history knowledge and learning to identify the species around me, which I think kind of just links into that sort of living with nature and having that connectedness to it, because we ultimately are a part of nature. We aren't separate from it, even in these urban spaces. And I think linking to something that Matthew had said about areas not necessarily having to be protected for wildlife to persist. Over the summer, I spent some time working with Network Rail, which at first does not seem like a necessarily wildlife friendly place to be. It's the railway, there's high speed trains running along railway tracks, but I managed to spend a day out with their in-house ecologist, and just hearing the stories of how wildlife can persist in these human managed urban spaces is just so amazing. I think one of the examples that comes to mind was of beavers and how they are actually a really massive issue for the railway, but because they're just so resilient and they will build up culverts so that water can't flow underneath, which causes massive problems to humans, but just kind of shows how resilient they are. It's the same with, I think there's a photo that I have of two juvenile barn swallows nesting in a tree in the lineside vegetation beside the railway, and I got told by the ecologist that actually, because humans don't really spend time rummaging around the vegetation beside the railway, it's actually really great for wildlife. Same for badger sets and things like that. So I think sort of, I guess, linking back to Matthew on the sort of national park level, it's really important to have that sort of local doorstep efforts to manage our biodiversity, but equally wildlife will persist and it will find a way. I'll pass back to Matthew now to kind of expand on that.
Okay, I'm not Matthew, actually. I'm going to let Matthew talk in a minute because I think he wants to come back in on this. I wanted to pick up on something that Eva was saying about learning at the university. So as a university, we have all these interesting multiple roles when it comes to nature. So we have this community organisation Transition, which is trying to engage people in really practical solutions and practical action. And we have different teaching, which is teaching about nature, but we're also really keen that people learn in nature. And we also support at the university this broader theme of education for sustainable development, which is about imagining what kind of future we want and how we might get there. And part of that recognises that, yes, we need very specific knowledge, such as what tree is this? What animal is this? How do we know how beavers are going to react in particular habitats? We need to be able to understand some of the wider strategic consequences of some of our decisions about creating protected areas or about leaving islands and how we can best manage islands. So we need that academic theoretical understanding. But when we are teaching, we also want to raise awareness and we want to give specific knowledge, but we also want to support our students to develop competencies so that they can actually go out and make a difference when it comes to nature restoration, when it comes to being able to work effectively with people and with nature. And so some of those competencies might include, for example, systems thinking. We've all talked about ecological systems and including people. So when you have systems thinking, you involve people in much more detail. Future thinking, being able to predict and consider what the consequences might be of something like releasing beavers or taking people away or having rats on an island. Critical thinking, being able to think critically about some of these processes and be able to reflect in a normative way back on the consequences of our colonial actions, for example. Being able to work with others in a collaborative way. It's why some of the projects that we have with Transition and other partners are so exciting. And being able to manage these things in appropriate ways. So with our students, we're always trying to support and nurture our students to be graduates who can go out and achieve some of these and have the capacities to deal with our ever-changing world. I think, though, Matthew would like to talk a little bit more about the protected area concept.
To some extent, I was going to come back upon the point that Ali was making about integrating wildness into public parks and spaces. Early in my career, I did a lot of work with community woodlands in the southwest, and one of the criticisms that we found that came back to us was the way that we would allow grass to grow long in between the rows of trees that we would plant because it looked messy. Now, nature likes messy, it likes chaos, it likes randomness. What I would classify as the short grass and lollipop tree of the municipal landscape from the 70s and 80s is still with us culturally, and we have an issue about things like restoring verges or allowing verges to grow longer, that people have an expectation of short grass equals well managed, and people feel comfortable with that, and that's sort of a cultural facet because that's what they've known all their lives. So when conservationists come in and say, well, actually we would like to let the grass grow longer and let the weeds grow a little bit and maybe some brambles come in, people find that very uncomfortable. And the importance here is that we have to work with communities and individuals on that principle. It's very important that we bring people along with us, and it's not about lecturing them on, that's wrong, this is right. It's about actually encouraging them to understand and hopefully share and value what is perhaps a less manicured landscape, so one that facilitates wildlife more and allow it into our rural and urban spaces, but our community spaces, and sort of change the dynamic of these. And I think doing this can then also encourage people to take those steps in their gardens, and this is how we build up networks and extensive habitats across urban areas. It's quite important that we bring people with us on this message because we've had a lot of resistance in area. And the same thing, you mentioned beavers, so we're about to release beavers into the Cairngorms, hopefully later on this year. We're being very careful to talk to communities, especially farmers who feel that this is a threat to their livelihood, and say, okay, what mitigation can we do? How can we make this a positive experience? And it is controversial with land managers because they are unsure about the change, and farmers in particular are under huge pressure at the moment because of uncertainty about farm payments and things. It feels to them like, oh, another thing on top. So we have to work as well as we can with these communities to bring them along, and hopefully they'll be positive advocates in years to come.
Yeah, selling it to not just the land managers, but I think it's the people that undertake the maintenance as well, and their perception is that we've got you know, as a land manager or somebody that's undertaking maintenance, you're trying to second guess what your clients are, I guess. What do people want? And you're right, that perception that they want Victorian sort of garden spaces or golf course management of grassland or lollipop trees, is this what we really want? And we know, and Eva and your colleagues have been doing surveys on this with staff at the university and students over the years, and we know that students and staff are wanting much more biodiversity, want to see that kind of wilder space, and trying to encourage the grounds team to undertake those sort of changes and be braver. Also get a bit of learning and training, and think, Rehema, when you're talking about training or learning for us, maybe in an academic institution, it's ensuring that also our ground staff are trained and understand the processes, the ecological processes that they're trying to stimulate within undertaking the management of these spaces, because it is a bit different. Maybe we're trying to be a bit more like farmers in some way, and sort of stripping out the nutrients so that we can, you know, allow greater competition and increased biodiversity within the plants and the insects that we see. So that agency, I wonder also if we can support it, one, by, as Matthew said, by working with the communities and ensuring that they're aware of the opportunities that this presents. And also selling the vision, because I think when you go in and you say you're going to take something away, you're going to take that space away within a park, for example. I'm going to make that look messier. It might come across like that, but if you're not selling the vision that, oh, if we manage it in this way, we're going to get all these incredible butterflies, we're going to get this beautiful color through the whole year. So we've got to be selling that more, and maybe the kind of networks that we have. We're on the 5 Communities Climate Action Network that ran an event last year on biodiversity and sort of grassland management, and it was one of our biggest, most well attended events. People really had a hunger to understand how this could be brought into their local community, and how they can support and give agency to the local authority to take on these changes and do it in a way that makes sure everybody's sort of, I suppose, on board and doesn't come back. And there will be and I think we've probably all experienced or seen that, where there's some people will complain, and maybe that can overshadow the silent majority that are really happy and really want to see this sort of stuff going on. Thanks.
It's really interesting hearing you and Matthew and Eva all talking about different actors and who can be involved in nature restoration, regardless of whether it is with the absence or more commonly the presence of humans. And I think what I was hearing from Eva was that the individuals, it's really important for individuals that every single individual manages to find some kind of connection with nature that can then support them, but that also they need the knowledge, and we'll talk maybe a little bit later about the kind of actions that individuals can take. But what's also really encouraging is talking about individuals in groups, and that can happen in different ways. So Ali, you were talking about communities, and I know transition is just fantastic at being able to motivate people and get people to come together and to act for nature in positive ways. But even more than that is when you have a community group that engages more widely within with other partners within the community. And I know we've worked with the Botanic Gardens, we've worked with Fife Council, we've worked with a number of different partners locally, and we heard the same thing from Matthew, of course, talking about Cairngorms National Parks, trying to partner with local farmers and landowners and recreational walkers and so on. So you have this kind of scaling then from an individual to a community to these kind of wider partnerings, and that can give you regional effects. And it may seem like it's a tiny little project, the Meadows in the Making project that's happening at the University of St Andrews, but when you start to cascade these across multiple partners and multiple places, you can start to see that you have some kind of an impact in the way that nature, the corridors that you build, and the way that nature can actually come back. And finally, I think we haven't really always talked about the global level. We said it's very difficult to not have a presence nowadays because our effects, our actions here influence, for example, climate change, and climate change then has an effect on ecosystems on the other side of the world. So we're all connected, and we can have positive effects, but we can also have negative effects on global biodiversity in that way, which is a little bit sad. I wonder, before we leave, I think it would be great if we could have everybody just give us a positive action. You as an individual, what is it that you might be able to go and do? So I think we'll start off with you, Matthew. Can you inspire people? You're probably going to tell people to go and visit the national park.
Well, actually, no, I'm not, because there are things you can do right on your doorstep, much in some ways that are more effectively. Sure, visiting a national park is a wonderful thing, and it's nice for people to come and see the landscape of the scales of here or Loch Lomond. But if you're going to do one thing, it's about getting involved. It's about, even if it's just joining your local wildlife group, and there are some fabulous NGOs out there who are only too happy to have people come along and help volunteer. Go and clear a ditch on a Sunday afternoon, or plant trees in the middle of winter, something like that, with British Trust for Conservation Volunteers and other organisations like that. So much of the conservation in this country is done by volunteers. It's a massively important area. So even if you just joined the organisation and didn't go out, you're helping support that. So that's what I would say, is go and join it. You'll learn about what happens. It's always a good feeling when you go and help out, but even just getting the magazine sometimes is kind of nice too. So yeah, that's what I would say. If you did one thing, go and join one of the conservation volunteer groups.
Oh, that's perfect, Matthew. Just queuing me up there. We have got a large list of projects and work that needs to be undertaken along the Fife coast, mainly in St Andrews, but right away from Guardbridge to Cambo, coming up over the next 18 months. And there'll be practical conservation days every Wednesday afternoon, plus others that you can get involved with through Transition University St Andrews. And these will be everything from managing meadows, creating hedgehog homes, planting trees, managing trees, even wetlands. So please, get involved with that. But I guess then that allows me, I'm just saying what Matthew said, really, allows me to also say that you should, if you've got somewhere, plant a tree. We're as Fife Communities Climate Action Network, we're supporting a campaign to plant a tree in everyone's garden this year. So you can get a free tree from them, and fruit trees we're also pushing as well. So please join that sort of campaign. Give nature a bit of a home with that as well. Eva, pass over to you.
Yeah, I feel as though most of the things that I was going to say have just been said, but go outside and sort of join a wildlife group or take some friends out. And I think for me, the best thing is, go outside and start to learn what it is that you're seeing around you, even in urban spaces. It's amazing just how biodiverse and how wild some urban spaces can actually be. And I think for me at least, having started to learn, how to identify birds and trees, I kind of get to enjoy introducing my friends to that. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a long-tailed tit, I'll point it out and I'll tell my friends about it. And it almost feels as though introducing someone that you're friends with to another friend. It's like learning to know your neighbours and learning who they are. And I think with that also, we do sort of start to nurture this idea of we live with nature, we don't live beside nature, we don't have a separation. And I think that's the best way to sort of deal with the idea of presence and absence. We are present and it is present and we are the same thing. The spaces might look different and the landscapes may be different. You may be in different countries if you aren't a UK-based student, if you aren't Scottish, even more local. But I think the best thing you can do is go out and ask what it is and sort of learn who your neighbours are, really. And I'll just pass back to Rehema.
Yeah, I agree with Eva. I think everybody's given such good suggestions, and I really love what Eva was saying about going out and getting to know your biodiversity, getting to know where you live and getting to know the different species there. But even before you get to know them, I think I'm going to suggest that you do two things. And one is just go and be in nature. And before you start to learn about it, just be in nature. And we all love the Cairngorms National Park, but we don't need to go that far. And I think we've all been saying that nature is right here on our doorstep. And that might be a local park, it might be in your garden, it might be in a hedgerow, it might be in a hedge, it might be in a tree that's in your street. There are, again, we're lucky in St Andrews and we're lucky in Fife that actually we're quite rural. There's a lot of green space around in different ways. So I'm going to suggest that you do two things. I'm going to suggest that you go and you sit in nature. I know that sounds a bit dodgy this time of year, so dress up really warm and go out and sit down somewhere and just notice. And see if you can notice the birds that come. See if you can notice how the wind feels on your face. See if you can observe whether it's the water across the, whether it's the wind moving across the sea, whether it's the sand whipping up a little bit, whether it's the feel, perhaps if it starts to rain, the actual feel of the rain on your skin. They've just said recently that going out for a walk in the rain is actually really good for us. It gives us the same kind of physiological effect as being beside a running river. So that's one thing, just go into nature. The second suggestion is to actually observe some aspect of nature really closely. If you want to, take a photograph, but just look really closely at a flower or a leaf or a bug or a bird or a footprint. Just look at the real closeness as well as at the landscape, because sometimes we get lost in the landscape and not the detail. My final plug for your action to find ways that you might do things and ways to get involved is actually to look at the St Andrews Prize for the Environment event that's going to happen this next week. St Andrews Prize for the Environment celebrates each year 3 fantastic projects which are selected from a whole bunch of different applicants, and they are really inspiring stories. So I really suggest that if you want to finish on a positive note and be really optimistic about what can happen, you might go and have a look at the finalists which have been selected for this year. I'm going to finish with also asking you to go back to the museum and to make sure that you go and have a look at the Wardlaw Museum's exhibition on the return to Mingulay. Perhaps now that we've talked a little bit about absence and presence, you'll be able to see that in a slightly different way. It's going to run until January the 7th of next year, and the museum is open for other activities as well, Monday to Friday, 11 to 7, and 10 to 5 on the weekends. You can also find out some more online. You can follow the museum on social media as well as if you want. And as I said at the very beginning, I think museums are really interesting places to start to provoke, to inform and to inspire people about issues such as getting back to nature and supporting nature in different ways. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think what we've found is that it's not a case of absence or presence. We're present even if we think we're absent, but mostly what we need to do is to be present and to be able to think in different ways about how we can be in and with and of nature. I think we've talked a lot today about enhancing understanding, but also connection. And through understanding and connection comes an ability and a desire for action. And through that, we can actually support nature restoration. And that means not just supporting nature, but also supporting us as humans, because we're dependent on the nature that we want to support. Finally, I just want to say thank you very much to the panelists who've come on board and who've engaged in this critical conversation. It's been really interesting to hear how you've responded to these different questions. I've really enjoyed it. I hope we can do it again sometime. And I'd just like to thank Sarah Collar and her colleagues from the museum for enabling us to have this conversation today. So all of you, please go out and see what your local nature is up to just now. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.